Hello, and welcome to Khyber Shards, a 5th edition actual play show set in the Eberron campaign world. I'm Philip, and since I'm alone and it's Friday, you can probably guess that this is another episode of Khyber Shard Answers, our Q&A show that we do on Fridays after our shows come out on Mondays, to answer questions from our viewers that we get through YouTube comments and also, primarily, through our Discord, which you can find linked down below if you want to ask questions about the show to me as the DM or to any of the other players. You can put them in the comments or you can ask them over on our Discord, and we will get to as many of them as we have time for, and often more of them than we have time for. If you've watched some of the more recent episodes, you know that we can go on for a while with the number of questions that we get. We love the interaction that we get. We love being able to explore the questions, and we love the thoughtfulness behind a lot of the questions that we get. It really has given me a lot of opportunity as a GM to hear a lot of interesting things about the player characters. So I find this very useful. Today I'm solo, giving the players a break and going to be looking at the factions and politics in Stormreach. We've now encountered a few different militias in Stormreach and a couple of gangs, and there been some questions about the specific factions and also about the rules I'm using for factions and how those work, especially now that the group has reputation with a couple of different factions. Well, the group has reputation with one faction. Pog has acquired some reputation with another faction due to certain events that I did not anticipate. So we'll be talking about that today. I'll also get into a handful of viewer questions that we got. But let's go ahead and dive in. We're going to start at the top of the food chain, more or less, and this is a question that was asked from Richard. He asks, who are the Stormlords, individually and as a group, and how do they interact with the Dragonmarked houses, Knights of Thrain, etc., if at all? On that front, the Stormlords are... So Stormreach was founded as a pirate haven sometime around YK 800, which is about 200 years ago in the world that we are playing in today. It was a pirate haven and a center for illicit activity and smuggling and that kind of thing. When the Kingdom of Galifar tried to conquer Stormreach, the Stormlords resisted successfully, managing to block off the sea lanes between Sharn across the Thunder Sea and Stormreach on the southern end. And the Thunder Sea is particularly known for storms, and so it's a difficult crossing. Ultimately, the Kingdom of Galifar decided to make a deal instead. They allowed Stormreach to remain independent. In exchange, the Stormlords agreed not to target Galifar shipping anymore. And the Council of Stormlords was formed shortly thereafter in order to manage the city. The Stormlords are made up of 5 families that were the original pirate lords of Stormreach. Every single one of them claims that it was one of their ancestors that founded Stormreach in the first place, but these were the 5 most important pirate families when the city was founded. They are the Aminatus, the Lassites, the Omarans, the Selshadras, the Wilkses, and the Wilkses, yeah. And currently, the heads of those families are mostly descendants of the Stormlords that began the council. The one exception to that is the Aminatu family. Yorick Aminatu is a 260-year-old dwarf who is one of the original Stormlords. He's the only surviving original Stormlord. Each Stormlord kind of has their own domain within the city. They have districts that they are most influential in, but also have some area of responsibility within the city's government. For example, Yorick Aminatu is in charge of the Stormreach Watch. Most of the watches, the Stormreach Guard. Most of the Guard's officers are relatives of his, members of his family. Varen Lassite. The Lassites were smugglers rather than pirates, and when Stormreach when they sort of went legit, I guess, they became brewers instead. And Molu's distillery is still one of the cornerstones of the Stormreach economy, and then the export of alcohol from Molu's distillery is one of the major financial centers within the city. Varen is very well liked. He's not a controversial figure. He's not really in with any of the major factions in the city. Remains somewhat neutral, and he's generally well liked. And as such, he is in charge of diplomacy and commerce. So he's the spokesperson for the Stormlords when they interact with foreign governments, like the various nations of Khorvaire, now that the last war is over, and also with the Sarlonan nation of Riedra, which has an embassy in Stormreach and a colony elsewhere in Zindric at Darkat, with Arenal, the island nation of elves north of Zindric, that also has an embassy in Stormreach. So Varen handles the foreign relations side of Stormreach. Paula Omarin's family, she is a human. The Omarins have not really quit being pirates. Paula's family, the Omarins, not long ago, a couple of generations back, actually tried to overthrow the Council of Stormlords and become the rulers of Stormreach by themselves. The rebellion was a failure, but the Stormlords, in exchange for an enormous indemnity from the family, allowed the Omarins to keep their seat on the council. So Paula Omarin is from the least wealthy house, and so has been seeking power elsewhere. She has developed a very close relationship with House Deneth in order to build up her potential military strength. She's also developed a strong relationship with the Warforged of Stormreach, and has recruited a number of them into her own personal enforcement unit called the Iron Watch, which we saw Ari attempt to impersonate one of the Iron Watch earlier. The Iron Watch sometimes act as police. They sometimes act as law enforcement. When the Stormreach Guard can't handle the situation, the Iron Watch will sometimes come in, and that is their official, legitimate function. But mainly, they are Paula Omarin's personal guard and enforcers, and they're loyal to her, not specifically to the city. Her family, though, does also control the Stormreach Forge, and she's in charge of maintaining city infrastructure. So has a lot of potential influence, but due to the rebellion in the past, Paula Omarin is working with a slightly less impressive hand than some of the other Stormlords are at the moment. Interestingly, the head of House Omarin is still chosen by ritual combat rather than by hereditary means or election or whatever. The next Stormlord is Kiris Selshadra, and Kiris Selshadra is a Zil gnome. If you know much about Eberron, you know that the Zil gnomes are known for spycraft. Zilargo is run by a triumvirate, and its law enforcement agency is referred to as the Trust. The Trust is Big Brother. It's an Orwellian police state that's kind of utopian and dystopian all at the same time. The main reason I say that is that the Zil all like it. They're all fine with the presence of this all-seeing invasive government. So the Selshadras left Zilargo, although some suggest that maybe she's not really, that Lady Kiris has remained in contact with the Trust and is actually operating as a Zil agent, but that's unsure. But they were also smugglers, largely from Zilargo, and she functions as the city's spy master, and is largely responsible for law enforcement in terms of the punishment of criminals. She has a close connection with the Red Ring, the gladiatorial network, where a lot of criminals are sent in the city, as well as with House Durrani, the house that does a lot of espionage and assassination work, the Dragonmark House of Elves that does that with the Mark of Shadow. Lastly, there's Jonas Wilkes. Jonas Wilkes has only been a Stormlord for a couple of years, and it's widely considered that the death of his father is one of the worst catastrophes to befall the town in a while, because Jonas Wilkes is not thought of as worth anything. Wilkes is the harbor lord. He has control of the harbor, in theory at least, and is responsible for that really very central aspect of the city's economy. But he doesn't really do his job. He has a reputation for laziness. It's thought that until his accession to his position, he was a member of a gang called the Golden Lions, which is a bunch of privileged upper-class kids who run around playing at being criminals for the amusement. And his mother is increasingly desperate to get him to actually take his responsibilities seriously, but not very successful so far. And so some suggest that Lady Tulea ought to be managing the harbor, or perhaps is the one actually managing the harbor, because the longer that Lord Jonas ignores his duties, the more power that House Lyrandar gains in the harbor district, and the more control over shipping to and from Stormreach it gains. In fact, over the last couple of years, House Lyrandar has managed to get permission and has begun the construction of its own line of docks adjacent to the main harbor of Stormreach. And there's concern among many of the city's merchants that House Lyrandar will begin redirecting shipping to docks that they control and that they can charge fees on and that sort of thing. So that's a concern to a lot of the businesses of the harbor district, is Jonas Wilkes' failure to take his job seriously. So those are the Stormlords. As a group, though, they're not really very unified. They're unified in their interest in Stormreach's survival. They're unified in their interest in profit. But beyond that, they're not a cooperative bunch. They are, after all, pirates. And you really need only look at the history of the attempted pirate republic in the Bahamas to really get an idea of how pirate government works in terms of unity. It's just not going to be very unified. These are essentially anarchists trying to run a government in a very simplistic way. So they're not very cooperative with each other, and this is one of the reasons that you have so many other factions. If the Stormlords were united, were unified, they might be able to push out some of the other factions, or at least force the other factions to work for them. Instead, the other factions are able to play the rivalries of the various Stormlords off against each other in order to gain influence and breathing room in terms of how they operate and to get left alone. For example, the Aminatus and the Omarans do not get along well at all, and so that's a rift in the Stormlords that can be exploited by a faction trying to gain a little more influence or a little more independence from them, and that happens a lot. So what the Stormlords have is official recognition by foreign powers, and that's important because foreign powers do a lot of business in Stormreach, and if the Stormlords fell into chaos, someone like a country like Riedra or perhaps Brayland might take the opportunity to come over and, pacify the area as of course, a peacekeeping operation, not an invasion. So it's in the interest of all the Stormlords to, in the end, put aside their differences and get along. But where they can, they will undermine one another to gain advantage. And the same thing is true for the various factions, criminal and otherwise, within Stormreach. They all benefit from the independence of the Stormlords. And so if they were to undermine the Stormlords too much, that would harm the various factions in the long run, because most of the factions that are here to get away from more traditional government types. Okay, so those are the Stormlords in general. That's their basic interaction with the other factions is one that we could call symbiotic. As long as both are benefiting, as long as the Stormlords are benefiting, they're more or less letting the other factions do what they will. And the reason they would do that is because none of the Stormlords are really that sure that the other Stormlords won't turn on them at some point. And so all of them hope that if it came to that, they would be able to pull in some of the other factions in order to get, hence Lady Omarin's cozying up to House Deneth is in the interest of self-preservation, as is her creation of the Iron Watch. If it comes to blows again with the Aminatus or with someone else, then there you go. She has backup, potentially. And various other Stormlords have connections to some of the other factions for the same reason. Curacel Shadra hopes that she can count on the Gladiators of the Red Ring, as well as some of the more nefarious criminal organizations like the Fleas, that kind of thing. In addition to that, we got a question regarding some of the other factions. Leopard asks, I would love to know how the individual neighborhood safety patrols, presumably like the Knights of Thrain or the Swords of Karn, interact with the forces of the four Stormlords that we haven't seen much in this campaign, while they seemed everywhere in Eberron Renewed's Campaign 1. That's true, and some of that is just a difference in what Eric wanted to highlight about Stormreach and what I wanted to highlight about Stormreach. It's also, to a certain degree, the way the characters worked. In Eberron Renewed Campaign 1, we very quickly made contact with a couple of different Stormlords, so it was clear that we were going to have a connection there. Eric also had a plot involving one of the other Stormlords that connected to the main plot of the campaign, so it makes sense that he would highlight that as well. But also our characters were largely the kind of characters, especially my character, largely the kind of characters who were going to deal with the recognized authorities rather than get involved in the underworld. But also the ecosystem of criminals and militias and all that stuff in Stormreach is so complex that when you consider that Eric was really only looking to build a single arc around Stormreach and not a whole campaign, it doesn't make a lot of sense to try and dig into it all at once. So Eric pulled in the things that were necessary for the arc for Stormreach and left the rest of it more or less alone. Whereas since we're building a campaign centered on Stormreach, it makes more sense to highlight the more diverse ecosystem of factions within the city. As to how the various safety patrols interact. So by safety patrols, I'm assuming Leopard is talking about the militias, like the Swords of Karn, or the Knights of Thrain, or Danel's Wrath, or the Ninth Wands. So everyone's got turf. It's a lot like any kind of organized crime. There is a recognition of turf, and as long as they stay out of each other's way, everything's fine. Not many of the militias, as distinct from gangs. The distinction is that militias are political, whereas the gangs in Stormreach are purely criminal. They're criminals for profit, whereas the militias have some sort of political objective. So most of the militias, their political objective is not specific to Stormreach. So the Swords of Karn are a collection of veterans from the last war from all the armies. I realize their name, the Swords of Karn, implies that they're from Karnath, but while their leader is from Karnath, most of them are not necessarily, they're not all from Karnath. They're named after the same person that Karnath is named after, the great warlord Karn the Conqueror, who expanded the kingdom of Galifar to include, who conquered much of Corvair. And he's sort of the Alexander the Great or the Napoleon of Corvair. So the Swords of Karn are interested in reuniting the kingdom of Galifar that fell apart during the last war, but they don't want to do it under any of the current leaders. They think that their commander, Drago Thul, who was a Karnathi soldier who rose through the ranks to become one of Karnath's greatest generals in the last war, They think that Drago is the man to be the new king. They want to see Drago the First as king of a reunited Galifar. They're in Stormreach because this is a place that they can go in order to hide out, in order to get away from particularly the authorities of their various kingdoms, because these are all soldiers who are, still operating despite the fact that they're not at war. And Drago himself is wanted by the Carnathi crown. So their political ambition is not in Stormreach. Stormreach is a base from which to make their political ambitions real, and they have a network on Khorvaire. They have a network throughout Khorvaire. Stormreach is just a safe base for their chief to operate from. So they don't have any reason to want to kick out all the other militias in Stormreach. They have an agenda, and it takes them away from Stormreach. So they want to maintain peace here. So as long as they stay off the turf of the others, then you can live at relative peace. Same thing is true of the Knights of Thrain, their neighbors. I tend to think of Thrain and Karrnath as enemies, and they were all enemies of each other. But again, Swords of Karn not being specifically Karrnathi, it's not a problem. The Knights of Thrain, likewise, are Thrainish nationalists. They are the descendants of knights who refused to swear loyalty to the theocratic government that took over Thrain during the middle of the last war. Their parents and grandparents fled to Stormreach and continue to recognize the sovereignty of what in Thrain is called the Blood Regent, Diani Irwinarn, who is the scion of the old royal house of Thrain that's no longer in charge. But the Knights of Thrain continue to recognize her as their sovereign and not the Speaker of the Flame, though they recognize her religious authority. They don't recognize her as their political sovereign. So they're rebels, more or less, who are living in exile, hoping one day to return and see Diani back on the throne as Queen of Thrain. So again, their ambition isn't to turn Stormreach into a new Thrain, it's to go home and put their queen back on the throne one day. So they're, Jacobite exiles from Scotland living in France, to put it in a historical context. The Swords of Liberty, same thing. They're a militia from Breland that wants to see the monarchy overthrown and a republic established, but not in Stormreach, in Breland. Stormreach is a place to lie low. The Order of the Emerald Claw want to see the Blood of Vol put back in charge in Karrnath, and have other goals, but they're not here to conquer Stormreach. The only militia that really has specific ambitions for Stormreach is Denel's Wrath. Denel's Wrath is also a widespread network that are Kyran patriots who want to see a nation established, a new nation, a new homeland established for Kyran refugees, for Kyran survivors of the Morning. The local group of Denel's Wrath, they're named after the last queen of Kyre, the local group of Denel's Wrath is of the opinion that Stormreach should be new Kyre. So they have an actual agenda for Stormreach, but they're not yet a large enough militia to make that a real danger. So they're probably a militia that the Stormlords would be leery of, but at the moment they don't seem to present a real threat. They're not going around proclaiming their intentions to conquer the city or anything like that. So within the political ambitions of the various militias, they don't have any reason to fight each other, so they're staying off each other's turf, and the gangs mostly do the same thing. As far as how the militias interact with the Stormlords, again, since their ambitions are largely outside the city, the Stormlords look on most of them as free law enforcement. The Swords of Karn keep Southwatch practically free of crime. They're very draconian about their rules, especially in Grindstone, but they keep the city more or less. They keep their part of the city free of crime. The Knights of Thrain do patrols through the city, through their neighborhood, making sure that there aren't people breaking into houses, that sort of thing. So they kind of act as neighborhood watches. They act as heavily armed neighborhood watches, but they they serve a law enforcement purpose that's beneficial in keeping the city stable. And that's what the Stormlords want. The Stormlords want stability. Stability in which to do business, and stability in which to make a profit. So that's what the Stormlords are mostly looking for. So within that, you have the gangs. The gangs are going to get the attention of the Watch when they operate too far outside the law. But most of the gangs, you can get away with a lot in Stormreach by bribing the Watch, which is how the Amanatu family stay very wealthy, is they happily accept bribes to allow minor crime to go on without any kind of punishment. Now, if you went on a murder spree in Stormreach, that would cross a line at a certain point. If you endangered the Stormlords, that would cross a line. Probably if you directly attacked the Dragonmark houses in a really obvious way, that would cross a line and would draw the Stormlords' attention. Because the Dragonmark houses are a potential source of profit to the Stormlords. As to the Dragonmark houses, speaking of that, most of the houses have an enclave in the city. Not all of them have a significant enclave in the city. In fact, a lot of them do their business out of offices that they rent from House Kandaric, which operates a big tower called the Tower of Kol Koran, which serves as an office building, although a mysteriously heavily fortified office building for the Dragonmarked houses. Some of the Dragonmarked houses have their own enclaves. House Thrash has its Dragon Shard refinery, and the Finders Guild operates out of a building attached to the refinery, so the Thrash has their headquarters there, in Cross, where our players are interacting with a lot. House Lyrindar has its harbor, as well as the Falconer's Tower, which is the main airship dock for Stormreach, and they have their offices there. So some of the houses have enclaves within the city. House Vedalis, as we saw, has Tooth and Nail, which is a store where they sell exotic animals. That's really their only big presence. They are notably absent from the city, although there is rumor of a large House Vedalis facility somewhere on Zendrick that's just not within the city, but no one really knows what's up with that. But their main presence in Stormreach is just their retail outlet. So the houses bring business, the houses bring profit, the houses bring jobs. All of these things are good, and the Stormlords want them. The Stormlords are suspicious of the houses. All of them, even Omaran. The Stormlords are suspicious of the houses because the houses tend to be grabby about power, and the Stormlords don't want that. So, like their relationship with foreign powers, the Stormlords are trying to walk a line between making profit off of the relationship with the Dragonmarked houses and not allowing the Dragonmarked houses to grab too much of their turf. Would be kind of the relationship that's going on there. I want to highlight a couple of other factions that have become relevant, and a couple other that operate in the area that our players operate. One are the Stormhammers. We've met some Stormhammers. The Stormhammers are a famously violent gang. They operate in Denel's Pride, which is the same area where Denel's Wrath operates, and so there's a lot of clashes potential there. They're dangerous and violent. They're not very big, and they have a very limited territory, but they are extremely violent when committing crimes. They seem to revel in violence, or at least that's their reputation. Again, this is a city where rumor is a big thing, so you take it with a grain of salt. They don't do a lot of crime broadly in the city, and that is a little bit strange. They tend to focus on extortion and theft within Denel's Pride, but other than that, it's not really clear what their primary business is, if they have one. But like some of the militias, they live in Stormreach as a hiding place. They are, or at least they claim, to all be survivors of the Morning, and so it makes sense that they would need somewhere that they could live where they're not going to be viewed, or they're not going to be just tossed out, because a lot of mourning survivors have been rejected by the Five Nations of Corvair because, well, there's this fear of what did they bring out with them. And, as we've seen, there's some weirdness with Tommel that indicates that maybe they did bring something with them. There's also the Fleas. The Fleas are a gang of cutthroats, or not cutthroats, cut purses, of pickpockets, mostly made up of young people. The gangs kind of protect them and view them as maybe apprentices for future employment once they reach adulthood. None of the Fleas stay in the Fleas after adulthood. They always leave the Fleas at that point. It's not really known who runs the Fleas, but if you get your pocket picked in Stormreach, it's probably by one of the Fleas. And then there's also the Red Ring. We talked about the Red Ring a little bit. They're the gladiatorial network in Stormreach. Some of the gladiatorial network is managed by the heads of various gladiator stables, or gladiator schools, to use the historical term. These schools operate very, very differently. For example, Kolos is the head of the Ivory Horn School. His school is notorious for a couple of things. It's famous mainly because Kolos does not employ any unwilling gladiators. Some of the other stable masters make use of criminals that are given to them by Kiris Selshadra to fight in the gladiatorial pits and train criminals, as this is your only option, but other than execution. Kolos doesn't do that. Kolos only hires volunteers. He pays his gladiators well, and he gives them the best accommodations that he can afford to. So Kolos is a little bit of an exception there, but the other gladiator, other members of the Blood Council, which is the group that organizes the Red Ring festivities, Kolos is the only one who doesn't use forced gladiators, which is interesting and presumably, to our minds at least, admirable, but at least a little strange to the minds of the others who participate in the Red Ring. So the other thing that I want to talk about a little bit is what's the mechanics behind this. So I have adopted the mechanics of a supplement called Ultimate Kingdoms by Legendary Games, which you can find on DriveThruRPG or on Amazon, depending on whether you prefer PDF or hard copy. This has a set of rules for factions that mirror some of what you would have seen in old 3.5 books or in Pathfinder. Basically, the players have and I'm having them track this mostly as a group, but the players have a reputation level. They have a point system of reputation, and where they are on a scale depends on, where they are on the scale indicates what services they might be able to make use of from the particular faction that they are in with. So they have acquired some reputation with the Swords of Karn, and the sorts of services that they could call on the Swords of Karn at their level, which is the lowest level, would be they could take out a loan from the Swords of Karn to acquire some cash. They could also purchase weapons and armor, or borrow weapons and armor in some cases, from the Swords of Karn. Since the Swords of Karn are a primary military organization, they have a large armory, and the players could get some gear from them, that sort of thing. So right now it's not anything super fantastic, but at higher levels, if the players decided to pursue a relationship with the Swords of Karn, at higher levels the player characters could get access to some Swords of Karn warriors to join them on an encounter, to join them on an expedition of some kind, and fight for them. And that's, there's some potentially impressive stuff there. At higher levels, they could get access to some magical items from the Swords of Karn that could be bought at a discounted rate or even just borrowed for the purposes of an adventure. So there's things like that. Pog also has some reputation now with the Red Ring, having beaten Kolos in a bet, more or less. And part of that reputation is from carrying around Fury's Edge. One of the stats that I put on Fury's Edge is that it increases his reputation with the Red Ring, with any member of the Red Ring that recognizes the weapon. So Pog's got some reputation there. But since he hasn't really explored that relationship yet, I'm not going to get into what the potential benefits of that relationship are. But you can imagine that it would be to a certain degree similar, although different in type, to what you might get from a military operation like the Swords of Karn. So there's a lot of different stuff like that. It's a pretty simple scale. There's not a whole lot of, there's not like spending reputation up and down. When the players do things that benefit the faction, their reputation goes up. When the players do things that harm the faction, their reputation goes down. And these things affect their interactions, as well as giving them access to certain goods. The book also has organizational rules, and should the players ever either become a part of or even control an organization, we might use those. They're a little bit more complicated, so I don't really want to get into that right now. I'll get into that if and when it comes up, because I'm just not sure if that's the direction the campaign is going. Anyway, that's a real quick and dirty tour of Stormreach's factions. If you are interested in that, you can find online PDFs of the City of Stormreach book, which has a much more detailed breakdown of all of these things. And it's frankly one of my favorite supplements ever as just as a D&D book. It's just got some really great stuff. So if you can get a hold of a copy of it, I highly recommend it. It's unfortunately out of print. You can buy the PDFs on the DM's Guild, and you can still find used copies sometimes, though they tend to be pretty expensive. All right, so let's look at a couple more questions. We had a couple more here. There was another one from Richard. Richard asked, not that this is happening in Khyber Shards, but the Discord is alight with discussion of PCs not getting along. I'm sure. As a DM, how do you handle when you have players at the table who are not getting along? And similarly, characters that do not get along, especially due to excellent roleplay. So I'm trying to think. I've never actually run into the problem of players who just can't stand each other. I almost exclusively play with people I know, and I avoid playing with strangers when I can. But even my experiences of playing with strangers, I've just never run into this. I've run into, things where players are not, clicking particularly, or where players will occasionally get on each other's nerves because that's just life. But I've never run into the issue of players who just could not get along. If I did, as a DM, I try not to get in the middle of player relationships. If it's affecting the game and players are playing their characters a certain way in an attempt to irritate other players, I'd probably have a talk with that player. It would depend on my relationship with that player. If I was running a game at a con and that was happening, I would say something just straight up, because we're running a game here, got a limited amount of time here, come on, let's have fun. If it was friends, that makes it a little more delicate, right? Because I'm not really in a position to boss them. But I would try to understand what was going on and if there was anything I could do about it. But I'm not gonna therapize. I'm not gonna mediate interpersonal conflict. I'm gonna advise them to talk to each other and figure out if they can resolve the conflict. And if they just dislike each other so much that they can't resolve the conflict, and they're also not able to set it aside for game night, then maybe they don't want to play D&D with each other, or maybe one of them doesn't want to play D&D with each other, and that's kind of their call. My expectation would be that if they're both going to come to my D&D game, that they would put aside whatever drama is between them and play the game. If they can't do that, if they're going to make the game about their drama, I would be inclined to ask one or both of them to step down, or I might just put the game on hold. If these are really good friends of mine, then the game is not more important than that, and I might be tempted to just put the game on hold, let things cool off, and we'll do something else for it. We'll play board games, or we'll just have game night again another time later when things have cooled down. But like I said, I've never really run into a situation where I had two players who just couldn't get along. Characters who don't get along, I've had a lot of that, and I don't mind it when it's recognized and okay with both players. The thing you want to be careful about with characters not getting along, and I do not think this has happened yet, is you don't want characters who are putting each other in positions where they have no options. I try to avoid PvP unless it's desired by both, and even then, little leery of it because it's hard to move past that in some cases. But if it's coming down to one of the players are going to push each other, the characters are going to push each other to the point where it's going to come to blows, then that can be an interesting story element. But probably one of the players is going to be pulling their character at that point, right? Because if you're at a point where you can't be around this person without violence, then this group is not for one of you. Maybe it's not for both of you. And that happens. And again, as long as all the players are having fun, I am fine with whatever player character conflict there is. Because player characters, I love it when player characters are three-dimensional. And when you're three-dimensional, you're not going to get along with each other all the time or every day. When you're not getting along with each other, you're going to do things that irritate each other. And that happens. Obviously, it's happening in Khyber Shards. We've got player characters who are not always getting along. We've got player characters who are, we got 4 players. We've got 4 player characters who have been operating solo for 2 years and are now operating as a group for the first time in that 2 years, or more or less for the first time in 2 years. So we got 4 solo acts trying to be a band, and they're not very good at it right now. And of course, that's going to create some conflict. How will they get over it? I don't know yet. That's kind of the question that we've begun to ask in Act 1, is this group capable of being a team? So far they've gotten through, but it's not been clean or pretty. So we'll see. The current adventure is one that they all have an interest in have a vested interest in seeing succeed. So I assume they're going to work together the best that they can, and it will be very interesting to see how it plays out and whether or not it plays a role in bringing them closer together as a team, or if that's still down the road. But that's my read on what's happening in Khyber Shards and how I would handle it. If I have player characters who are not getting along, but the players are all having fun, and it's not player drama playing out at the table, then let it ride. I'd let it go. As long as it is that. And when it stops being that, then, maybe we deal with it. We'll work it out. Jerry asks, hey, for Philip, can you show your books and pick out like 5 to 10 of them that you might have used as inspiration for any campaign, specifically Khyber Shards? I have never built a campaign that I have run specifically around a book, with, I guess the exception would be, I have a game that uses the One Ring system, which is set in Middle Earth, so it's inevitably based on Tolkien's Legendarium. But beyond that, I've never run a campaign based on a work of fiction. I have run campaigns based on ideas from history. I've run campaigns based on, obviously, Khyber Shards was inspired by X-Men. So the X-Men that I really like are a couple of different varieties. One is I grew up on the 90s cartoon show. So obviously that's a big part of my X-Men influence. And then I started reading comics more regularly in college. So House of M, Messiah Complex, Messiah War, X-Force, Second Coming, that series of events in the X-Men universe is some of my favorite comic book stuff. I love it. It's impactful. It's moving. I think it's fantastic. So those are all things. I wouldn't say they've been in in general, as X-Men things, they are an influence on Khyber Shards, but I can't right now say they're an influence on what's happening in Khyber Shards. I've got some things planned that are more based on comic book ideas, but I'm also trying very hard. I don't want this to be just an X-Men homage. I don't want I don't want it to become a one-to-one thing where, well, okay, well, obviously Donna Bella is Jean Grey or something like that. She's not, by the way. Um, so I don't want it to be that, and this person's Magneto and this person's Sabretooth, and so forth and so on. Obviously, there are going to be similar things we've called out, that Tommel's attitude towards non-mutants is kind of militant in the way that Magneto's is, although Magneto's at least a little conflicted about whole-scale murder, whereas Tommel seems a little more open to that sort of thing. So I'm trying to avoid a one-to-one thing, but yeah, there's arcs in my head and adventures in my head that will have parallels to X-Men comic things. So yeah, those other books that inspire me in terms of D&D. Actually, Eric got me a couple for my birthday recently. The Atlas of Cursed Places and the Atlas of Lost Cities, both of which are just short little tourist books, more or less, about places that are sort of haunting or creepy and abandoned cities, which I find very useful and interesting as potential for encounter locations and that kind of thing. I like things like that. The Atlas Obscura is kind of the same way. It's a book my wife has that's kind of the same thing, but a little less specific. And so books like that, things from history, but not a lot of fiction that I've actually run a campaign on, and not a lot, certainly not many novels, not any novels that I'm basing Khyber Shards off of. I will often read a story or see a movie and think, oh wow, well that's just such a D&D campaign right there. But I've never actually done it. The one that I would most like to base a campaign on would be the book Sharps by K.J. Parker. I think it would be a great short campaign, and that would be a lot of fun, I think. So I apologize, I'm not really able to give you a bunch of books that I've used as inspiration for Khyber Shards, but books that I have used to inspire elements of campaigns. Okay. Aside from those X-Men books, Under Heaven by Guy Gavriel Kay, Barrack from Eberron Renewed was Barrack from Eberron Renewed was loosely initially based on the character Tay from Under Heaven, which is just a beautiful novel. And if you haven't read it and you like fantasy set in an Asian setting, I highly recommend it. It's just beautiful and wonderfully bittersweet. There are a couple of characters. I've designed a couple of NPCs. I steal NPCs a lot. That's what I steal from fiction a lot. I definitely steal NPCs from fiction quite frequently. So lots of characters that you will meet are stolen from video games or movies or TV shows. Voices that I do are usually heavily influenced by TV shows, accents that I've listened to enough that I can do them. So that one of my home games right now is inspired by Deadwood in some senses, the TV show Deadwood in some ways, and also by a historical place in California where that's like the Wakamatsu Tea and Silk Farm, where some exiled samurai families from the Boshin War in Japan settled on a little colony in California, and you had a bunch of ex-samurai living there on the colony in California. And so my home game takes that idea and combines it with a lot of the themes and archetypes from Deadwood. But most of the things I pull from campaigns tend to be either characters from books or ideas more from TV shows and movies. I do a lot of voices from TV shows. So that's kind of the fiction that inspires things with D&D, not so much. I've never really used a lot of novels for inspirations for specific campaigns. Again, aside from my One Ring game, which is obviously inspired by everything Tolkien. And our last question from our very own RA. What are the Knights of Thrain up to these days? No reason, just curious. You know, they're patrolling the streets, looking for monsters, protecting the world from supernatural harm, and planning the return of Blood Regent Diani. Anyway, I hope that was interesting. If not, I apologize. If you have any more questions about Stormreach or its lore or the way that it works in my game, feel free to let me know in the comments. I'll get back and I'll get you a reply with a little more information. If there are any other world questions or world topics you'd like to see covered in a future Khyber Shard Answers, feel free to let me know that as well. In the meantime, if you want to get in touch with us, you can find us on all social media as The Geek Pantheon on Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and on our Discord, again with the link down there. We also have a Patreon if you're interested in helping us do this a little bit better. A lot of the ability that we have to do recording like this, at good quality at least, is due to the generous donations of our patrons. You can find us at patreon.com/thegeekpantheon. There are various tiers which have different benefits, but our Discord is open to everyone. So if you want to come and chat with us about Khyber Shards, Eberron Renewed, Eric's D&D videos, or Eric's streaming schedule, come talk to us. In the meantime, this has been Khyber Shards. I'm Philip, and thanks for rolling with us.